Picture two, radically different recordings of the exact same song. I mean, they occupy two completely different musical universes.
Right, it's basically night and day.
Exactly. So on one hand, you are standing in a Chicago recording studio in, 1960, and you are listening to Howlin' Wolf's original Chess Records release of a song called Spoonful.
A total classic.
Yeah, and what you hear is a tight, 2.5-minute monophonic Chicago blues track. It is raw, it is perfectly efficient, it has a clear beginning and end, and it hits you right in the chest.
Right, it does exactly what it needs to do.
But then you fast forward just 8 years, now you are standing in the crowd at Winterland in San Francisco. This is in March of 1968.
A totally different vibe.
Oh, completely. You are watching a rock band called Cream play that exact same song, except now it is a sprawling, massive, nearly 17-minute psychedelic rock monolith.
Yeah, I mean, it is an absolute sonic mutation. You are basically looking at two entirely different species of music sharing the same DNA. And the environment that forced that mutation, it is entirely structural.
And I think the craziest part about this evolution is that the core of that massive mutation really comes down to one brilliant musical constraint, because the legendary Willie Dixon, who wrote the song, he made this genius decision to strip the original harmonic architecture all the way down to a primitive, static, single-chord E minor modal drone.
Right, just locking it in completely.
Welcome to Deep Cuts and Deep Thinking.
Yeah, so our mission for this deep dive into the source material is to explore exactly how that single-chord constraint by Willie Dixon actually forced Cream into a spatial vacuum. It was a literal acoustic void, and it demanded these extreme technical workarounds from their highly specific gear. So as we break down the physics and the psychology of this performance, you are going to see how the sheer act of three musicians trying to fill that vacuum, well, they accidentally laid the physical and sonic blueprint for heavy metal.
It's wild to think about. So let's start with the trap that Willie Dixon set in 1960, right? Because to really appreciate what Cream had to overcome, we have to look at the architecture of the song itself.
Yeah, the foundational architecture.
Right. So usually a blues song uses a standard 12-bar progression, the kind of song that moves predictably through chord changes.
Exactly. You expect it to go to the 4-chord, the 5-chord.
Yeah. But Dixon locked Spoonful into a static E minor drone.
He completely took away the roadmap. And, it is not just that he stayed on one chord. He specifically omitted the major third from the harmonic structure.
Wait, why did he do that?
Well, taking out the major third completely prevents any sense of diatonic resolution. There is no release at all. So the listener is just suspended in this, permanent state of harmonic tension.
Wow. So a standard chord progression is kind of like walking down a staircase, right? Gravity does the work, you take it step by step, and you know exactly when you're going to hit the bottom.
That's a great way to put it.
But a modal drone, that is like being suspended in zero gravity. There's no down to fall towards, so the musicians have to invent their own gravity just to move.
They really do.
But wait, if they're suspended in that single E minor chord for nearly 17 minutes, doesn't that get incredibly boring? I mean, for both the band and the audience. Where is the momentum coming from? There are no chords to change to.
Well, you would totally think it leads to boredom, sure. But the human brain actually processes that lack of movement in a very specific way.
Okay, how so?
Well, when you remove vertical chord changes, that normal staircase you just described, you remove the traditional way musicians create momentum. And that absence actually creates intense psychological tension. It triggers something called the Zeigarnik effect.
Oh, I've read about that. That's the psychological principle where the brain tends to obsess over incomplete tasks, right?
That is the one, yeah. By never resolving the chord, the song feels like a permanently open loop. The brain is constantly waiting for the musical sentence to finish, and it just never does.
So the listener is basically trapped on the edge of their seat.
Exactly. Because the musicians cannot rely on vertical chord changes to provide that satisfying resolution, they are forced to explore the space horizontally.
Horizontally, meaning what exactly?
Meaning they have to rely entirely on microtonal pitch bends, physically bending the strings to slide between the notes. That and rhythmic displacement, just to keep the listener engaged. They're constantly inventing new ways to create friction against that one static E minor root note, rather than, moving away from it.
Okay, so if they are forced to explore the space horizontally, that brings up a massive physical problem for Cream specifically, because you've got Eric Clapton on lead guitar, Jack Bruce on bass, and Ginger Baker on drums.
Right, a classic power trio.
Exactly, they are a power trio. So if you don't have a musical map and you only have 3 people on stage, how does the sound not just completely collapse when someone takes a solo?
Well, that structural vulnerability is exactly what we call the spatial vacuum. Think about a traditional rock or blues band from that era. You usually have 5 pieces. Crucially, you have a rhythm guitar or a piano filling out the mid-range frequencies.
So they are kind of holding down the middle?
Yeah, we are talking about the acoustic space roughly between 300 hertz and 1 kilohertz. That mid-range is the sonic padding. It is the acoustic glue that holds the high notes and the low notes together.
But a power trio doesn't have a rhythm guitarist to hold down the fort. So when Clapton takes off on a lead guitar solo, what actually happens to the sound in the room?
The floor drops out entirely.
Really? Just completely empties out?
Completely. When Clapton stops playing chords to play single notes, he vacates that mid-range space. It leaves a massive empty acoustic hole right in the center of the music.
Wow. And because Dixon's constraint has them locked on that single E minor drone, they can't even use a clever chord change to distract the audience from how empty the room suddenly sounds.
They are completely exposed, yeah. So to keep the music from sounding thin and hollow over that single chord, the rhythm section couldn't just play standard supportive beats.
Right, they couldn't just lay back.
Exactly. A traditional walking bass line or a simple drum backbeat would just vanish into the void. To survive the performance, Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker had to radically expand their playing horizontally into those mid-range frequencies. They had to physically invade the space Clapton left behind.
This is the part of the deep dive that completely blew my mind. They didn't just play louder or play more notes. They literally engineered their gear to physically take over that empty space.
Oh, absolutely. The gear was crucial.
Let's look at that highly specific, customized gear architecture they used. Let's start with Jack Bruce. So he was playing a short-scale Gibson EB3 bass.
Yeah, the famous Mudbucker.
Right. It is a 30.5-inch scale compared to a standard 34-inch. Does shaving 3.5 inches off the neck of a bass really change the sound that much?
Oh, it changes the entire physics of the instrument. Think about a rubber band. If you stretch a long rubber band between your fingers and pluck it, it feels very tight and snappy.
Sure, it has that bright twang to it.
Exactly, and that is a standard 34-inch bass.
Yeah.
But if you use a shorter rubber band tuned to the same pitch, the string tension is significantly reduced.
Oh, so it's looser.
Right. The strings vibrate with a wider, looser arc. That lower tension produces incredibly thick, blooming low-mid frequencies. And it also allowed Bruce to bend the heavy bass strings almost as easily as a lead guitar.
That makes so much sense. And he also had that massive pickup right at the neck known as the Mudbucker, which just swallows up the low end.
It's a massive sound.
But the gear is only half the equation, right? Because Bruce was classically trained on the cello.
He was, yes. And he was deeply influenced by the classical counterpoint of J.S. Bach.
J.S. Bach, okay.
Yeah, counterpoint is a technique where instead of playing chords, you play multiple independent melodic lines that basically weave around each other.
Wait, so Bruce wasn't just sitting in the background thumping out the root note of the E minor chord?
Far from it. Bruce abandoned the traditional role of a bass player entirely. Because Clapton vacated the mid-range, Bruce used that short-scale Mudbucker bass to play high-register classical counterpoint.
So he's playing these complex melodies.
Exactly. He was moving all the way up the neck, acting as a second lead voice, weaving complex melodies right alongside the guitar to physically fill that acoustic hole.
He is literally leaving the basement to go pick a fight on the main floor. That is wild.
It really is.
But if the bass player is up in the mid-range acting like a second lead guitar who's actually holding down the rhythm and keeping time, you would think the whole song would just fall apart.
Well, that responsibility falls to Ginger Baker. But he doesn't handle it the way a normal rock drummer would.
No. What does he do?
Well, Baker sat behind a custom Ludwig kit, utilizing mismatched 20-inch and 22-inch dual bass drums.
Okay, wait. Having two different sizes of bass drums, like a 20-inch on his right foot and a 22-inch on his left, what does that actually do?
It creates distinct tonal separation. Every time he hits the right pedal, you get a tighter, punchier frequency. And every time he hits the left, you get a deeper, booming resonance.
Oh, so it's almost like having two different instruments down there.
Exactly. But it is his technique that truly fills the vacuum. Baker brought his deep background in jazz and African syncopation to a rock setting.
Meaning he isn't just playing a standard 4/4 rock beat.
Not at all. African polyrhythms involve layering multiple contrasting time signatures on top of one another simultaneously.
Okay, so a lot going on at once.
Right. Instead of laying down a simple backbeat so the audience can tap their foot, Baker used those dual bass drums to create a massive wall of polyrhythmic density.
Wow.
Yeah, he was constantly shifting the accents, playing against the primary beat, creating this rolling thunder that occupied the low and lower mid-frequencies that Jack Bruce had just abandoned.
Okay, let me make sure I have this picture right. The bass player is acting as a lead instrument playing Bach melodies.
Correct.
And the drummer is acting as a dense harmonic wall of shifting polyrhythms.
Yes.
And all of this creates a foundation for Eric Clapton.
And Clapton's setup for this era is just legendary. He was playing a Gibson SG, specifically the psychedelic painted one known as the Fool.
Oh yeah, that iconic guitar.
Yeah, and he ran it through dual 100-watt Marshall stacks. But the true secret to his sound, the way he cut through that massive rhythm section, it actually happened right on the guitar itself. He famously rolled his guitar's tone knobs completely down to zero.
Hold on. If you roll the tone knob to zero on a guitar, doesn't it just sound incredibly muffled, like someone threw a heavy wool blanket over the amplifier?
It does, yeah.
So why would he intentionally make his guitar sound duller when he is competing with Bruce and Baker?
Well, it would sound muffled if you were playing quietly in a bedroom. But this involves a fascinating quirk of acoustic physics.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
When Clapton rolled those tone knobs to zero, he was actively engaging a low-pass filter. Think of a low-pass filter, like a bouncer at a nightclub. It aggressively kicks out all the sharp, high-end treble frequencies and only lets the low and mid frequencies through.
Okay, so he is intentionally taking away his own treble. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but then he pushed that dark, muffled signal into the completely saturated power tubes of those massive Marshall amplifiers.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Yeah, when you push an amplifier that hard, the sheer volume forces the vacuum tubes to physically generate new frequencies that were not even present in the original guitar signal.
Wow.
These are called second and third order harmonics.
Wait, so the amplifier itself is generating artificial frequencies to fill out the sound?
Yes. The heavy saturation of those harmonics thickened the sound so dramatically that his single notes transformed. It became known as the woman tone.
The woman tone, right.
Yeah, and it allowed his guitar to sound almost like a bowed cello. The notes sustained indefinitely, and that immense thickness allowed a single string to cut right through the dense polyrhythmic wall that Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker were building.
So connecting the dots here, you have three absolute virtuosos. They are locked into a single static E minor drone by Willie Dixon.
Right.
And to keep the song from sounding empty, all three of them, the bass, the drums, and the guitar, are expanding horizontally into the exact same 300 to 1000 hertz mid-range frequencies.
Exactly, all occupying the same space.
So what happens when three massive egos try to occupy the exact same sonic real estate on a stage?
Well, what happens is that the performance devolves into literal acoustic warfare.
They are essentially fighting for the oxygen in the room.
They truly were. You have to remember the interpersonal friction within Cream. Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker despise each other.
Oh, really? I didn't know it was that bad.
Oh yeah, they had a history of actual physical altercations in previous bands. And on stage at Winterland, that hostility was weaponized through their equipment. They were operating at a stage volume of roughly 120 decibels.
Just to put that in perspective for the listener, 120 decibels is the recognized threshold of human physical pain. It is the equivalent of standing next to a thunderclap or a commercial jet engine taking off right there on the stage.
It's deafening. Now imagine the physics of that volume. Because Jack Bruce was pushing his Mudbucker bass into the mid-range at 120 decibels, the physical sound waves from his speaker cabinets would literally shake Ginger Baker's drum kit.
Oh my gosh, seriously?
Yes. The sheer air pressure of the bass frequencies was masking the transients, the sharp initial attack sounds, of Baker's snare and kick drums. Baker was quite literally caught in the physical crossfire of the triple Marshall stacks.
If the sound waves are so loud that they're physically vibrating the drum hardware and drowning out the actual drums, how does a drummer even fight back against that kind of amplifier volume?
He can't fight with volume, so he uses time as a weapon.
Time.
Yes. It introduces a survival tactic called decoupled chronometry.
Decoupled chronometry? That sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. Is that just a highly academic term for stage sabotage?
Essentially, yes.
Wow.
In a normal band, the most fundamental rule is that everyone works together to maintain a unified, steady tempo. The rhythm section is supposed to be locked in.
Right. They are the anchor.
But during these extended 17-minute jams of Spoonful, Baker would intentionally decouple his timing from the rest of the band. He would accelerate the tempo, driving the beat faster and faster and faster.
He is deliberately playing the wrong tempo. Why?
To force Jack Bruce to drop his complex, melodic Bach counterpoint.
No way.
Yeah, Baker knew that if he pushed the tempo fast enough, those intricate bass lines would become physically impossible for Bruce to play. He was trying to trip him up and force him back into a simple, fundamental rhythm roll.
That is incredibly petty and absolutely brilliant at the same time. And how does Bruce retaliate when the drummer tries to run away with the tempo?
Bruce retaliates by intentionally dragging his notes behind the beat.
He slows down.
Exactly. He would play complex, conflicting syncopations, for example, playing 5 beats against Baker's 4, just to disrupt Baker's dual bass drum patterns.
Just absolute chaos.
It really was. Bruce used the massive weight of his low-end frequencies to act as an anchor, physically dragging the tempo back down against Baker's will.
They are literally fighting for control of the song's heartbeat in real time. And Clapton is just stuck in the middle trying to soar over this rhythmic battlefield with his woman tone.
Exactly. He's just trying to ride the wave.
But the incredible result of all this musical combat is what happened to the genre of rock music itself. By attempting to solve the spatial vacuum of a one-chord drone, using maxed out Marshall stacks, overdriven mid-range frequencies, and relentless polyrhythms, Cream accidentally laid the physical and sonic blueprint for heavy metal.
It is a perfect accidental synthesis. If you look at the defining characteristics of the heavy metal genre, what are they?
I mean, loud guitars, heavy drums.
Right. High volume amplification, overdriven mid-range frequencies fighting for dominance, highly active and distorted bass lines, and incredibly aggressive polyrhythmic drumming. Cream did not set out to invent a new genre of music at Winterland.
Right, they weren't sitting there drafting a manifesto.
Not at all. They were simply trying to survive a 17-minute one-chord blues jam without sounding thin and losing the audience's attention.
They were just trying to survive the void.
Precisely. In filling that spatial vacuum with absolute maximum volume and extreme technical virtuosity, they created the template.
That's amazing.
Yeah, bands like Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and eventually the entire heavy metal movement would take that exact physical blueprint and just build an empire upon it.
So let's tie this all back to where we started. Willie Dixon sits down in a Chicago studio in 1960 and writes a brilliantly simple, stripped-down blues constraint, a 2.5-minute song built on a single E minor drone.
It really was a masterclass in minimalist tension.
But that exact structural constraint is what forced 3 British musicians, 8 years later, to completely reinvent how instruments interact and how they occupy physical space on a stage. They took a structural void and filled it with a 120 decibel war.
They filled the vacuum with sheer force.
It really is wild when you trace the causality of it all. And, it leaves me with this final thought for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. Willie Dixon's original lyrical metaphor of a spoonful was about how a tiny, almost microscopic amount of something, whether it is love or money or whatever you desire, can completely overwhelm your senses and drive you crazy.
That's a great point.
Isn't it incredibly ironic that Cream took a song entirely about the overwhelming power of less and transformed it into a 17-minute, ear-shattering overdose of more?
An overdose of more. I love that.
If you like this episode, please like and subscribe.